friends, and welcome to episode 14 of the Rob Breakenridge Show. Great to have you along with us, and plenty to get into on this episode of the program. We will hear shortly from University of Alberta energy economist Andrew Leach. The ambitious and sweeping Bill C-5 is now the law of the land. So what will that look like in practice? Now, the Prime Minister has again suggested that a new pipeline project, as well as a massive new carbon capture project, could be advanced under this law. We'll find out just how realistic that all is. Meanwhile, we will look at how this is all playing here in Alberta as the Premier continues to push the Carney government for pipeline approvals and the scaling back of other federal laws. All of that, of course, amid dueling petition campaigns and the increasing likelihood that Albertans will be voting at some point on the question of remaining in Canada. So what's Danielle Smith's endgame here? Columnist and commentator Max Fawcett will join us later. Plus, the latest on our trade talks with the United States, as this week begins with Donald Trump releasing new letters and imposing new tariffs on other countries. It looks like we're still aiming for a Canada-U.S. agreement by July 21st. Now, those talks, of course, briefly collapsed last week after Trump reacted angrily to Canada's digital services tax coming into force. And then suddenly, at the last minute, we scrapped that tax. We'll get into all of that with economist and Howe Institute Senior VP Daniel Schwanen. But we start with all the news coming out of Calgary in recent days, where the stampede is in full swing, which of course also means that political leaders are descending upon Calgary as well. The premiers of Alberta and Ontario held a very interesting joint news conference on Monday, which we'll get into in a second. But the Prime Minister is in Calgary too and came bearing an encouraging message. Mark Carney told Post Media in an interview on Saturday that it's, quote, highly likely that a new oil pipeline will make the cut for their list of major projects that are deemed to be in the national interest under this new Bill C-5. That could also include the Pathways Alliance project, this massive proposed carbon capture and storage project in Alberta. Carney went on to say, quote, I am confident that my government will do everything we can so that those projects can be built. And we shall see, of course, if that proves to be the case. Now, in the meantime, the premiers of Ontario and Alberta, as mentioned, shared a stage at a press conference Monday in Calgary to jointly press the Prime Minister to follow through on some of these grand commitments and to take steps to repeal other harmful federal policies they've identified, such as the West Coast tanker ban, the net zero electricity regulations, the oil and gas emissions cap, and the electric vehicle mandate. Daniel Smith and Doug Ford also signed two memorandums of understanding aimed at strengthening interprovincial trade, driving major infrastructure development, and growing Canada's competitiveness. And there was certainly no sign of the tension between the two that had previously been there, if you recall, with regard to how best to respond to Trump's tariffs and the initial trade tensions with the U.S. And really, it's pretty clear that Alberta has a strong ally in Ontario on these issues that we've identified as so important. So here's the response to a question posed to the premiers about new pipelines specifically and what they hope these new MOUs can accomplish.
First of all, I'd say we have done lots of polling on the attitude towards pipelines. And in every single province, it's a majority, and in some cases well above 70%. I don't think Ontario is any different. Ontario, I think, knows that with Line 5 right now, it goes through Michigan to feed Sarnia, and that is puts them in a precarious position. The governor of Michigan has been trying to shut that pipeline down for years. And so we have always felt that having a Made in Canada solution with a pipeline option going to not only Ontario and Quebec, it just makes sense from an energy security point of view. And the world changed in November. And I think Canadians understand that we've got to start acting like a country. We've got to start supporting each other. And I think that is the prevailing sentiment in the country. But I'll let Premier Ford speak for his own people.
Well, thank you, Premier Smith. Premier Smith was bang on. We have the governor of Michigan constantly threatening to close down the pipeline. Do you know the disaster that would create in Ontario? It would basically shut down Pearson International Airport, largest airport in the country. Prices would go through the roof. I'm tired of relying on the United States. And let's make no mistake about it. I love the U.S. I love the American people. But there's one person that's causing a problem right now, and that's President Trump. We want to move forward. We want to build the AMCAN fortress. But the days of relying on the United States 100%, they're done. They're gone. We're going to start being reliant and self-reliant on each other. We have the strongest. We're an economic powerhouse in Canada. We're going to continue growing, free trade being one within all the provinces. That will add over $200 billion to our economy, anywhere up to 6% of our GDP. We have to start diversifying our trade right across the world. People would love great Alberta oil, that love products, critical minerals from Ontario. That's what we start doing, and stop being reliant on our neighbors to the south, because there's uncertainty right now and it's hurting our country.
And the fact these are MOUs, I mean, sometimes MOUs don't get a whole lot of traction. What makes this one different? Well,
what makes a difference, we're doers. There's a lot of politicians that are talkers, and the federal government, not the present one, because we're hoping we're going to be able to work with the present federal government. But for far too long, for 10 years, under Prime Minister Trudeau, they were treated terribly. The West was treated terribly, Saskatchewan and Alberta. And as I said in our meeting, and you heard it, Premier Smith, we got to start showing respect. Ottawa has to start showing respect to the great folks in the West, especially Saskatchewan and Alberta.
Now, meanwhile, here's Danielle Smith's answer to a question that was posed to her about the status of A, a possible new pipeline proposal, and B, the Pathways carbon capture project.
We are linking those two projects together. I know that the Pathways group of companies have been advocating for their Pathways project for some time, and even predates me. And it's a net zero by 2050 proposal that would include carbon capture, utilization, and storage, would include decarbonizing production through things like perhaps hydroelectric power, maybe small modular reactors. That's part of their plan. And then direct air capture for kind of that last mile. And we've got carbon engineering that is returning to Alberta, and a direct air capture facility in central Alberta as a result of that. So I feel like they have done a lot of work on scoping out what that project would look like. I know that they have been talking with the federal government. The federal government has expressed enthusiasm for that. But we have said that you can't just add $20 billion of additional cost to the industry. There has to be additional revenues to pay for it. Whether you are able to use the CO2 for enhanced oil recovery, that becomes a revenue stream, or whether you're able to build a new bitumen pipeline for export. If we had a 1 million barrel per day bitumen export pipeline off the West Coast, that would generate at today's prices $20 billion a year for GDP, of which governments get, somewhere around 40% of that, year after year after year. So you put that into context over a 20 or 30 or 40-year period with a $10 to $20 billion investment in carbon capture, that makes sense. But just putting additional cost on an industry and then threatening them with production caps through an emissions cap, that doesn't make sense. So those two conversations have to happen together.
Okay, so coming up momentarily, we'll dig a little deeper on what's changed now under Bill C-5 and whether it will indeed be easier for the federal government to not just approve these kinds of projects, but to see that they become realized. University of Alberta economist Andrew Leach will join us. You're listening to The Rob Breakenridge Show. While Prime Minister Mark Carney's very sweeping and very ambitious Bill C-5 is now the law of the land, over the weekend in Calgary, the Prime Minister suggested that this new law could indeed open the door to a major new pipeline project getting approval, or perhaps a massive new carbon capture and storage project. But is it all really that simple? Joining us for more, very pleased to welcome to the program Andrew Leach. He's an energy and environmental economist, also professor in the Department of Economics and in the Faculty of Law at the University of Alberta. Professor Andrew Leach, great to have you with us here. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Rob.
Okay, so as to that question, is it all that easy? Everything we've gone through with the Impact Assessment Act and just how challenging it is to get big projects done. Is there a hidden shortcut that's been there all along?
I don't think there's a hidden shortcut. I think the Bill C-5 does provide for some shortcutting, but that won't make either of these projects that Prime Minister Carney talked about sort of sure things or easy to get completed. As we've learned with Northern Gateway and Trans Mountain over the years, there's a lot more to it than just the federal government saying yes to a project.
Okay, but the Impact Assessment Act still exists. How does it fit in? Right? How does it work where a project can sort of be at another level or subject to a different kind of assessment?
I mean, I think the Impact Assessment Act, that's gotten a lot of play as then Premier Jason Kenney called it the No More Pipelines Act, et cetera. But really, it didn't change things in that fundamental of a manner, right? It said you still need a federal environmental impact assessment. You still need federal, whether energy regulator. So it used to be National Energy Board. Now it's Canada Energy Regulator. But you still needed sign off on both of those things, either under legislation that was in place when we reviewed Gateway early in the Harper mandate, when we reviewed Trans Mountain with new sort of Harper era legislation in that regard, or now. So you still have all of that type of hurdle. The details are a little bit different, but the broad scope is the same. What's changed with C-5 is essentially you're putting some of the political decision making at the front end. You're saying, okay, now the federal government's going to say that we're going to do the work to get to yes, as opposed to the previous, really all three regimes that were, do the work, we'll do the analysis, then we'll tell you what we think. Now they're saying, we'll tell you what we think, now let's do the analysis to make sure we're on the right track and to set appropriate conditions. So I think it does flip the script a little bit, whether it was Impact Assessment Act or Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, its predecessor.
So given the powers the federal government has in this area, is that constitutionally sound, do we think?
Oh, yeah, there's no question in my mind that C-5 is constitutionally sound as a piece of legislation. It's the federal government or Parliament essentially providing a roadmap for how to navigate parliamentary legislation. So it's not usurping any new powers. It's not changing anything in that regard. Where it will become challenging, as has been the case for pipelines under other assessment rules, is on the duty to consult in Section 35. That now you have this little bit of a weird world where the federal government's going to be making some very important decisions before they've acquired full information. So there is an open question as to how can you satisfy the duty to consult while at the same time kind of predetermining the decision on a project. So that'll be an interesting dance for the Prime Minister's office and the federal government as a whole.
And let's clarify a point, because I know the government did get some pushback in the legislative process, but on the duty to consult, that's more about a decision on a project, more about a project itself. I guess it's not necessarily about the bill or the legislation.
Yeah, so I guess there's a two-part answer to that. So generally speaking, the duty to consult does not apply to legislation. However, the duty to consult is about protecting the Section 35 rights that are constitutional. So you can't pass legislation to kind of duck around the Constitution. But what this does is it takes the types of decisions that would be subject to the duty to consult, executive level decisions, so regulations, approvals, etc., and it moves some of them in sequence. So you get the big political decision that used to be right at the end of the process, the last thing. And it was that decision that led to the reversal of both the Trans Mountain and the Gateway permits. Now that is moved effectively earlier on in the process to a decision to say, yes, we're going to list this project. And then from now forward, all decisions must be made with an eye to the approval of that project or to getting to yes on that project. So that's a little bit of untested territory in terms of how that interacts with what we would think of as the honor of the Crown and a duty to engage with First Nations in that, as governed by that honor of the Crown to protect their constitutional rights.
So in terms then of other federal legislation, the tanker ban seems like one example of this where there's a potential conflict. If the government says yes to a project under these provisions under Bill C-5, but that might bump into the tanker ban on the West Coast, for example, how is that to be resolved?
Well, so the implication in C-5 is that you would grant the bill grants the executive reasonable, like extraordinary powers under what are known as Henry VIII clauses to essentially exempt projects or to effectively change existing parliamentary legislation. So not really a constitutional problem, but it does hand a lot of power to the executive to say, okay, but that tanker ban is just not going to apply to this project, or it's going to apply in a particular way, or it's going to stand down subject to certain conditions. So, whether or not it makes sense for Parliament to have a tanker ban in place that doesn't apply to the one project to which it might apply, we can argue that, but I think they do have the power to work around it if they want to now.
And that certainly seems to be a project that the Premier has talked a lot about, the idea that maybe we can build another pipeline to the West Coast in an area that would be covered by that tanker ban. If we can deal with all of these issues, is there a case for such a project?
That's still an open question, right? We're still in a world of relatively low oil prices compared to when we've previously been discussing these rapid expansions. We have a very consolidated oil sands sector, so it's not the case anymore that you have every or almost every major oil company in the world kind of coming to our door saying, I want to build a project. We have pretty restrained new investment in the oil sands so far, a couple of new projects coming forward now, but the idea that you have, the Premier's been talking about a million barrel a day pipeline. The question of whether that would have enough commercial support, I think, is still an open one, but one that we should, in a way, let the market decide, right? You don't want either pundits or the government making that determination on their own. If you think it's not going to fly, okay, it's not going to fly. So that would be the first step in any project proponent coming forward. They're going to have to lock in some firm contracted shipping, and that in and of itself would give a signal from the market of whether the business case is there for the pipeline.
We seem to be hearing a lot less about the idea of an east-west pipeline or a pipeline to the East Coast. I mean, when you talk about whether there's a business case, there are always a lot of challenges with that kind of a project, and it almost seemed to be more political than economic. But does that seem to be off the table for now, do you think?
I think it's probably off the table for now. I mean, to be fair to Energy East, go back, they had 1 million barrels of contracted shipping capacity or close to it. So they did have that at the time, that very strong demand, because it was the best option available. The market was convinced you couldn't go west. You just had President Obama block the route south. And so basically all that you were left with was Energy East in an environment where oil was back well over $100 a barrel. So at that point, the market says, well, is it the best option? Absolutely not. Is it potentially better than rail? And I think the answer to better than rail was probably yes, by a small margin. And so the market was at least willing to see that project through. And you're right, the politics were there too. But, if you, at any point during that process, as we saw, once President Trump came in and said, you know what, we're bringing Keystone XL back, all of a sudden that became the preferred option. And, Trans Mountain's back in the picture. Okay, that's a preferred option. And I think that would still be true today. If you said, walk around Stampede with a sign that says, do you want to go west or go east? Everybody's going to want to go west.
So we've also now got the idea of carbon capture being linked to a new pipeline. And I guess we're going to increase capacity or increase production. We do need to address emissions. But I don't know, how serious is everybody about carbon capture and about this Pathways project in particular?
Yeah, I mean, the Pathways project is really about transportation, right? It's about the pipeline network and the storage components, which is a small share of the cost of carbon capture and sequestration. The real question is, are the companies, whether they're operating upgraders, operating in situ sites, operating hydrogen plants, et cetera, are they willing to put in the capture equipment to make that carbon dioxide available and then pay to have it transported and stored? And I think that's still a very open question. At today's carbon prices, it just doesn't make economic sense for the companies to do it. So they're going to do it for one of a couple of reasons. One, if it becomes clear to them that the trade-off is do this or don't produce oil, then it will absolutely make economic sense to do a broad carbon capture project. Two, the federal government or the provincial government or some combination pays for the lion's share of the capital and locks in some of the operating costs, then sure, right? As long as if you get a government-backed merchant rate of return on your investment in carbon capture, they're probably going to do it. But that's going to be very expensive for taxpayers. I don't think there's a third, we just do this. I can't see why at current carbon prices, at the current state of the market, that there'd be any interest in advancing that project. I think you'd be more likely to say, no, we're just going to wait and see whether the oil and gas emissions cap actually comes into effect, whether it's a future conservative government or what have you, the next government down the road is going to give us a different policy environment. We're just not willing to put that money up.
So would you say it's uncertainty that's the problem?
Well, in part, I mean, in the same way as if, somebody offers you a new job, you're probably not going to quit your existing one until you've got that signed on the dotted line. And it's not just how much am I going to earn on my first paycheck, it's does this actually pencil in the long run? And so, if you think of what carbon capture and sequestration is, it's a bet that I can get paid for not emitting carbon. So how does that happen? Either I avoid a carbon price that would have otherwise applied to me, or I get to do something that I wouldn't otherwise be able to do, produce oil sands. And either of those, there's potential that there's enough value there to justify doing carbon capture, but there has to be a regulatory backstop, and you have to be willing to bet on it in the long term. It can't just be, okay, well, 3 years from now or 5 years from now, there's going to be a government that's going to say, you know what, the carbon pricing system is gone, or the carbon capture subsidies are gone, or what have you, as we're seeing in the US right now, right? That now as the big, beautiful bill comes in and we see a lot of changes in the subsidies, those that were not locked in, those that were not guaranteed, that's changed the investment climate for a lot of that clean tech.
It's one of those projects that, Alberta wants it, Ottawa wants it. There seems to be that consensus, although maybe there's a bit of this finger pointing at one another in terms of who's responsible for delays or who needs to take the lead here. Where does that responsibility lie, do you think?
Yeah, I'm a little bit skeptical on this. We've been talking about this forever, right? Our first ever report to the United Nations in 1994 talked about an industry government consortium to deploy carbon capture and storage to decarbonize the oil sands. Premier Stelmach, when I was first in Alberta, ran a carbon capture and storage development council, back in during his premiership. We saw Premier Redford, I think, talked a lot about that as part of the national energy strategy. Prime Minister Harper had a big emphasis. So we've had this forever as sort of a promise that's out there of the link between, at the time, there was a lot of coal power talk, and the link between oil sands and action on climate change. I think that the fundamentals are like it is very expensive. It has to work over a very long term. And so you're always going to have that question where companies are just going to say, this is really uncertain that I get a return on this. And the uncertainty isn't what I'm used to. It's not commodity markets. I can't look out and think about supply and demand like I could about oil or gas or LNG. I have to think about political risk, and I have to think about who might win, not the next election, but 2 or 3 elections from now. And that's something I can't price. I don't know how to assess it.
And what's that effect then on other investment decisions? You talked about it's not just a case of getting to yes more quickly or easier. There's a long list, and you've shared it many times, a list of all kinds of different projects that have been approved, have a yes, have that green light, but aren't going ahead for various reasons. So what gets left out of that conversation then?
Well, I think that's, in a little bit, that's the danger that Prime Minister Carney has perhaps exposed his government to, is that in a way, he's sort of bought into the idea that it was the federal government and stuff that was standing in the way. And that if the federal government could just get out of its own way, a lot of this stuff would get built. And there's, number one, there are often a lot of provincial objections and well-grounded provincial objections to some of these projects. So we saw that, for example, with LNG in Saguenay, that it was the Quebec environmental assessment that rejected that project long before the federal government had a decision to make on it. We saw it with LNG in BC, where rules about power supply and the emissions associated with those were very important for LNG investments and slowed those down dramatically. So that's the first thing. Then the second thing is, of course, there are markets. So I took a lot of issue during the election campaign with a meme that Mr. Poilievre put out, that this whole list of projects that, were supposedly stopped by the Trudeau environmental assessment laws. None of those projects had been assessed under it. And some of them were things like, Mackenzie Valley Pipeline is a good example, that were bets on a commodity market of, 10 or 15 years ago. If you could bet on $10 or $12 gas, Mackenzie Valley makes sense. At $2 gas in Alberta or $3 gas, it makes no sense. And so there is just always, with these projects, markets ebb and flow. And in some cases, you get in just in time. In other cases, maybe the process slows down enough that you miss out on a money losing venture. We have no shortage of major industrial or mining projects that are abandoned across the country where the markets have just turned on them. So I think, there's a question here where Mr. Carney might have, on some of this, bought into it's the federal assessment stuff that was slowing all of this down and preventing all of our productivity growth, et cetera. And I think you can see some other reasons other than just federal approvals that are playing a role there.
Well, we shall see in due course what this law looks like in practice. We'll leave it there for now. Professor Leach, do appreciate the insight. Thank you so much for making some time for us here.
Thanks for having me.
All right, once again, there you go. That is Andrew Leach, energy and environmental economist. He's a professor in both the Department of Economics and the Faculty of Law at the University of Alberta. So some thoughts from him on what C-5 means, what it might look like in practice. Coming up in a moment, we'll talk about the political climate here in Alberta. I think a lot of these issues loom large in that conversation, but there's a lot going on here with the Premier launching this new Alberta Next panel, a meta conversation about separation, the likelihood that Albertans one way or another are going to be voting in a referendum. So what do we make of all of this? And what is the Premier's strategy in navigating all of this and what she's saying we're doing? We'll get into all of that with National Observer columnist Max Fawcett. My name is Rob Breakenridge. We're back after this. No shortage of issues these days in Alberta politics. Plenty going on, plenty to discuss. Very happy to welcome to the program for more insights on everything going on in Alberta politics these days. He is the Calgary-based lead columnist for the National Observer, nationalobserver.com, Max Fawcett, with us on the program. Max, so great to have you with us here. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on. Looking forward to our chat here.
A lot to get into, as mentioned, but I did want to start with the Premier's recently announced Alberta Next panel. We had one of the panel members on this program just recently, something you wrote about as well. So a different kind of perspective, perhaps. Your thoughts on why we're doing this once again?
I think we're doing this once again because it suits the political agenda and the political interests of the UCP government. It's the reason why we did it the first time with Jason Kenney. I think his approach was more measured, more serious. I think he was genuinely trying to address the anger that was out there, which ultimately ended up being directed at him. So he clearly understood the risk there. And I think Danielle Smith, from the very beginning, has decided she is not going to lose the way other Conservative premiers have lost. Whether it's Ed Stelmach or Alison Redford. Or Jason Kenney, she's not going to be defeated by her own party membership, by her base. And so she is going to do whatever it takes to keep them in the tent, in the fold, and aligned with her leadership. And that's what this exercise is all about. It's about capturing the energy from the separatist movement, which she has helped create, and preventing it from finding a new political vehicle. And she has said as much. She's acknowledged that she doesn't want to see another political party formed. And I promise you, she's not talking about another left-wing party. She's talking about an explicitly separatist party. She has failed in that respect because, of course, we have the Alberta Republicans. But that's what this is about. This is about keeping her in charge, in power, and keeping the focus of Albertans aimed at Ottawa rather than at Edmonton.
I mean, it seems pretty clear that if the Conservatives had won the last election federally, that we would not be having this conversation, wouldn't be going through all of this. I think Conservative premiers in Alberta maybe do benefit or try to benefit politically from having a Liberal prime minister. But do you think this is the outcome Danielle Smith wanted or that Danielle Smith envisioned?
I think if you gave Danielle Smith truth serum, she would tell you that she wanted Mark Carney to win the election. She has benefited tremendously, as have, as you say, most Conservative premiers, from having Liberals in power in Ottawa. It's when there's Conservatives in Ottawa that they lose government. And so, she enjoys, and she's very good at setting up that foil of, the evil Ottawa government that is trying to kill your industry and take your job and force you to eat bugs and whatever else it is. And having Pierre Poilievre as the prime minister would get in the way of that. And so I think she was quite happy, privately, to see the Liberals get reelected. She's kind of getting everything she wants right now because we have a Liberal government that is advancing pipelines even more aggressively than the previous one did, is doing a lot of the things policy-wise that I think a Conservative government would have done. It's sort of like we have a progressive Conservative federal government right now, but she still gets to fearmonger about Liberal Ottawa, about their net zero policies, about Stephen Guilbeault, all that stuff. And so it's a real having her cake and eat it too moment for the Premier.
Is there risk, though? You mentioned what happened to Jason Kenney, and I often wonder, was it also a case maybe of Jason Kenney kind of building up expectations, unrealistic expectations, and when that didn't happen or when those things didn't get realized, that movement kind of ate him up, And is there a similar risk to Danielle Smith here in what she's doing, and then once again failing to deliver?
I think so. I mean, I think if you are lighting matches around canisters of gasoline, there is a risk that things will explode. And I'm not sure it's going to be the same kind of explosion that ultimately took Jason Kenney down. I do think that she will ride or die with the furthest right reaches of her party. You look at the Alberta Next proposal or the process, and then you look at the recent, I don't know if you call it a budget or a vision statement or whatever it was, but tabled by the I believe it's the Alberta Prosperity Project, the explicit separatists. There's not a lot of daylight between what they're talking about and what the premier has talked about. So I think if there is a risk for her here, it is that progressive conservatives, the middle flank of her party, are going to just say, this is too much. It's enough. Maybe the business community starts to really push back when we feel the effects of the uncertainty this is creating. You've already had Nancy Southern, the CEO of ATCO, come out and say that the separatist stuff is not good for business. They've had investors walk away from a project they want to build because they don't want to touch the province right now. So you may get the business community aligning behind a more moderate conservative option, and lo and behold, you have the two MLAs who left the caucus who have now are trying to revive the progressive conservative brand. So it may be that in over-indexing to the further right reaches of the UCP, she is opening up the door to a revolt from the left fringe of the UCP, if you can call it that. History repeating or rhyming, but not repeating, I suppose.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, Peter Guthrie was an early supporter of Danielle Smith. He was a critic of Jason Kenney's COVID policies. Not someone you'd consider to be a red Tory per se, but I mean, it seems like a pretty principled guy. And so I think the way in which he left the party, and Scott Sinclair too, is interesting. I don't know. I mean, do you see that this new PC Alberta party, is this going anywhere?
Never say never in Alberta politics, as we both know. I think there's Paul Wells, ex-Maclean's writer. He wrote these rules for Canadian politics back in the day, and one of his rules was always expect the most boring outcome to be the one that happens. And in Alberta, it's the opposite. Always expect the most exciting or dramatic outcome to be the one that happens. And so I think something could happen here. You're right. These are not red Tories. I think all the red Tories have more or less fled the party to the NDP, but maybe that is part of the appeal for Peter Guthrie and the party that he's trying to create here is they can bring those people back from the NDP. There's a lot of red Tories who they voted NDP not because they love the NDP, but because they are so dismayed by the way in which the UCP has drifted to the right. And if there is suddenly a principled, pro-business, small government party, a more conventional, traditional conservative option, I think you could see just as much bleed from the NDP as you would from the UCP. And then we have a whole new ballgame.
Speaking of the NDP, I mean, Naheed Nenshi finally got his big by-election win. He'll be in the legislature finally. But I don't know, what do you make of some of these concerns or arguments maybe that he stumbled or that the NDP is underperforming right now?
I've made some of those arguments, and I've gotten some interesting flack from some of my progressive friends. But he has been, to my mind, just incredibly underwhelming. He came in with this enormous mandate. I think the NDP really the membership looked at him as a savior, and he seems to be running and carrying himself like he's running for the mayor of Alberta, and that's not a job. That's not a thing. He clearly thinks that the key issue is going to be leadership. It's going to be, do people like him more than they like Danielle Smith? And I regret to inform him and his supporters, but they like Danielle Smith more than they like him. The leadership ballot is not as one-sided as I think he would like to think. And the NDP actually has to have a strategy here that goes beyond Naheed Nenshi as the leader. It has to have policies. It has to have direction. It has been very absent from the debate around separatism, from the debate around our place in Confederation, and there was an interesting idea floated by Lisa Young, professor at the University of Calgary, that in response to the Alberta Next panels, the NDP should set up their own set of panels that actually look at the future, but from a optimistic, genuinely future-looking perspective. What are we going to build here over the next 20 or 30 years? I don't see the NDP doing that. I think that would be a really interesting exercise in narrative building, but they seem convinced, or at least Nenshi seems convinced, that he alone can fix it, that he is the solution, and as long as his name is on the ballot, they'll be okay in the next election. I don't think the numbers support that.
Well, it certainly doesn't look like it right now. I mean, a lot can change, as you say, between now and the next election, whenever that is. Do you think, by the way, that could be sooner than we think, next year, perhaps?
I do. I keep saying that, floating that I think the play will be to call the election next year after, whatever happens with these referendums. I don't think it will go to term. I've had people have pushed back and said, Danielle Smith was there when Jim Prentice went to the polls early and saw what that did. But 2015 is 1,000 years ago in politics right now. And I think that she might try to capitalize on the frustration that will be out there, and a ballot question that shouldn't really be to her advantage. Do you like Canada, or do you love Canada more than Alberta? But maybe will be, because she has so thoroughly controlled that narrative and dominated that field of play.
We've got these dueling petitions. I spoke with Thomas Lukaszuk last week, and the Alberta Prosperity Project, and they're trying to advance their own petition. So different kind of aims and objectives, a different question each would pose. But does it seem one way or another that we're getting a referendum?
It seems like that's a slam dunk at this point. I think the separatists are better organized. They have more passion behind what they're doing. They have, I think, the tacit, maybe not support of the Premier's office and her party, but certainly they are making the conditions as easy as possible for there to be a referendum on this issue. And so I guess their theory of the case is that this will help them let off steam. It will be defeated, and then we will move on. I mean, David Cameron had the exact same philosophy in Britain about Brexit, and we all remember how that turned out. So I think this is a very volatile situation. My head says that this can't take wind, that there just isn't 50+1% of the Alberta voting public that would go down this road, given the risks, given the downsides. But the inequity in the willingness to fight on the two sides makes me nervous. And the information landscape that we have, Senator Paula Simons was on a podcast the other day talking about how, her columns in the Edmonton Journal used to be read by, hundreds of thousands of people, and they could move political opinion. And today it just doesn't work that way. And I worry about that. I think, you could have people writing in the Edmonton Journal, the Calgary Herald. I could write my column saying, look, go through the numbers, go through the data. This is a terrible idea. It doesn't matter as much in this landscape that we're in right now, this media landscape. And the people who are pushing this know how to use the tools at their disposal. And they have some very powerful tools, including, again, the perhaps not support of the Premier, but the cooperation or the unwillingness of the Premier to come at this hard. Her job should be to knock this down. And she seems determined at every turn to lift it up. And that could have unintended consequences.
It is interesting because, she's made the argument that she is trying to take the wind out of the sails of the separatists by getting a better deal for Alberta. And, you wrote in a column recently that I think a lot of these points people are saying about, it's understandable why people feel this way, or Albertans have a right to be mad. Like, do you think that those who are professing to support Canada, believe in Canada, are kind of inadvertently helping the talking points of the separatists?
I do. And I understand why Danielle Smith and Jason Kenney do it, because they've been doing it for so long. I think it's almost like a political muscle. It's reflex at this point that they attack Ottawa, they criticize because it has worked so well for them. But when I hear Naheed Nenshi, and I hate to bag on the guy, but when I hear him basically echoing the same argument that well, it's true that we've gotten a bad deal, and it's true that the federal government has not done enough to help get our energy to market. It is incredibly frustrating, because that is not true. And I can go chapter and verse on the ways in which the Liberal government, although it has not talked about the oil and gas industry the way they would have wanted to be talked about, has done more to get oil and gas to market than any government in Canadian history. The facts are clear. But, I guess Mr. Nenshi feels like he has to placate that crowd, or he has to sort of start with that as his opener in order to get them to hear his other message. But I worry that the other message gets lost, and all the people hear is, yeah, we are getting screwed by Ottawa. Even Nenshi thinks that we're getting screwed. And eventually that takes hold. If a thing gets repeated enough in the public discourse, it becomes fact in the minds of a lot of people. And then when you try to bring actual facts into the conversation, they just don't work. And that's sort of where we're at today in Alberta. I feel like I can talk to people about how we're not really getting screwed. The federal government has actually been pretty good at the things that you profess to care about, but that's not what it's about. It's about their feelings. They want to feel like victims. They want to blame somebody for the changes that are happening in global energy markets, the energy transition. I read a story today that the CEO of Ford in the United States bought a Chinese EV and is just blown away by how far ahead they are. Like the things that are happening in China are happening, and being mad at Ottawa is not going to change that. But it gives people a sense of agency to be able to blame Trudeau or the Liberals rather than these global changes they can't stop impacting their own lives. And that, to me, is what this panel should be about. If the Alberta Premier is having a panel, hosting discussions, let's talk about what the actual future in this province is. We have a lot of opportunities. We have great things at our disposal that we can be doing. We can make lots of money, get lots of investments. But if we spend all of our energy being mad at Liberals in Ottawa, we are going to miss the bus here, the electric bus. And it is going to run us over. And then we're going to have some real problems to complain about.
Well, we still have a Liberal government. I think, as we say, that kind of precipitated a lot of what's happening now. But it's clearly a very different Liberal government, a different Liberal Prime Minister. Mark Carney is not Justin Trudeau. So how much of a factor is Mark Carney and what we're seeing with Bill C-5, even over the weekend, suggesting that, a new pipeline could be one of these new projects that are in the national interest?
Yeah, I mean, it is a very different kind of government. And you see that not just in the way Mark Carney talks about oil and gas, the way he talks about the urgency to build things. You see it in the way it's staffed. You see it in the senior leadership in the President's office and in the Privy Council. These are all business people. These are people who care about business. And admittedly, Mark Carney and his view of how business works is different from Danielle Smith. It's different from Pierre Poilievre. But he is a very formidable opponent on an issue that they have basically had free reign since Justin Trudeau was elected. Justin Trudeau did not spend much time, and that's being generous, thinking about the economy, thinking about markets, thinking about attracting investment. Mark Carney does. He spent his whole life thinking about that stuff, and he is bringing that focus to bear on a bunch of key issues. And we'll see over the next few months what actually comes of it. I am skeptical that there is a business case for a new oil pipeline to Tidewater. I think it will have to be built by the government, whether it's the government of Alberta or the government of Canada. But this is a new government, and Canadians are treating it that way. I know Conservatives in Ottawa are frustrated. They feel like this is just the same old guys. It's the Trudeau retreads. But I was on Ben Mulrooney's show this morning with Anthony Couch, who's former Poilievre staffer, and he said, whether his conservative friends like it or not, Canadians treat this as a new government. They wanted change. They're getting change. Yeah. And I think everyone kind of has to reset their thinking on that. This may be the continuation of a Liberal government, but it is a brand new approach to governing.
Well, it feels like that could be a game changer in Alberta. I think the ardent separatists will say it goes way deeper than that. They sort of reject the whole idea of Canada, or Canada's a lost cause, or Canada's too woke, or, we can stop paying federal tax and we'll all be rich. Like they've got all these other arguments. But I think just to maybe average Albertans or conservative Albertans, right, the idea of seeing this kind of a project, or seeing a government that's willing to take on that political risk and say, yeah, we're going to do this. Like, I think that would go a long way in changing a lot of the sentiment here. Do you think?
I think it would on the margins, on where it counts. There is a constituency, let's call it, that would be for separation no matter what. And it was that way under Harper. It was that way under Mulroney. Like, there's just a group of people that just do not like Canada. They are maybe pro-American. They have views about the way the world should work, and it goes well beyond sort of brass tacks issues that most people care about. But, in the cities, in Calgary and Edmonton and Red Deer and Lethbridge, among longtime conservative voters, I was playing golf the other day with somebody who said, he was a lifelong conservative voter, but he voted for Carney because he thought that he got it. He thought that he understood the mission, the job, the job description, and was doing well so far. And I think there are a lot of people out there like that who appreciate that Carney and the Liberal government right now are listening to Alberta, taking it seriously, and putting some skin in the game. Now, I feel like a broken record on this. The Liberals under Trudeau put lots of skin in the game. They lost votes in BC for buying and building TMX, and that doesn't seem to really register here. But it's always been the way the government talks about it that seems to matter more, not what they do, right? And Trudeau and certainly Stephen Guilbeault never talked about it the right way, and Carney does. Carney talks the language of business. He talks the language of investment, job creation. And I think it's just going to be really hard for Daniel Smith to keep making people angry at this guy when he's clearly trying to do the right thing for this province and, more importantly, for this country. And if she wants to go all the way to the right and rail against climate change, rail against net zero, I think that puts her in a very precarious position. I think Albertans are ultimately quite pragmatic about this stuff. But that is the choice that she's going to have to face, because this is not the same guy that she was dealing with over the last 3 years.
Speaking of Pierre Poilievre, I mean, what do you make of his situation now? He seemed like a conservative leader built to defeat Justin Trudeau, but he didn't get that opportunity. And I think a lot of uncertainty around his future. He's got to win a by-election here, which I'm sure he will. But to win over these people, I think, who are kind of almost writing off Canada, right? This is this constituency that he needs. And we see the polls, we see everything else going on. What do you make of his situation?
I think it's bleak. My opinion on internal conservative politics, I put large amounts of water in that particular wine because I'm not close to it. But people I know who are close to it have had similar perspectives, that he's in trouble. That, like you say, he was a machine built to do one job, and then the job changed, and he still seems to want to do that one job, which is defeat Justin Trudeau. One of the pundits, I think it was Corey Tanaik, was saying, in a lot of ways, Pierre Poilievre is more like Justin Trudeau than Mark Carney is. He has a lot of similar qualities to Trudeau. He has a lot of similar qualities to Donald Trump, and that's just not a good fit right now. So he is going to try, as he always does, to really kind of double down on the base, on the online part of the party, and it might save his leadership. I think we saw things during the election campaign where it looked to me like he was pivoting from trying to win the election to trying to save his job, to really kind of keeping the base on his side. But I've seen some influencers, some folks who are just diehard Poilievre supporters who have kind of said, this guy can't get the job done. He's not the guy to do what we need to do. And I don't know where the Conservative Party goes from here. That is not my remit. But my suggestion, I've said this in columns I've written, is they don't need to moderate. They don't need to become red Tories because that's not really a thing anymore. Mark Carney has all those voters locked up. He is basically a progressive conservative government. But they just need to find someone who looks and acts like a prime minister, right? I think one of the biggest mistakes they made in hindsight was getting rid of Aaron O'Toole. I think Aaron O'Toole would have done much better in the last election. I think he might have won. But they need someone like that, who is a conservative, who has conservative beliefs, but isn't petulant, isn't grating, doesn't drive women voters away the way Poilievre seems to, and it isn't sort of terminally online. I think we are going to be moving away pretty quickly from this moment of kind of maximum Trumpism. And people are going to want leaders who do not look like Donald Trump, not ones who do. And right now, Poilievre is not passing that test.
Well, what's interesting, Monday, the Calgary Stampede, or in Calgary, we saw this press conference, Danielle Smith and Doug Ford, these memorandums of understanding, and they're both kind of railing against federal policy. I don't think Danielle Smith has any national aspirations, but I do wonder about Doug Ford. And I mean, I was like a lot of people when Doug Ford ran for the Ontario PC leadership back in the day. I'm like, there's no chance. This guy's too out there. I wouldn't write off his chances after what he's been able to pull off. But I don't know. Do you see Doug Ford maybe as a lot of speculation as to whether he's angling for Pierre Poilievre's job at some point?
It seems like a possibility. There's rumors that he's taking French lessons. I don't think anyone expects Doug Ford to be good in French, but we just saw in the last election, Mark Carney wasn't that good in French either, and it didn't seem to matter to Quebec voters, not one bit. And so maybe that isn't as important of a quality as maybe we thought it was once. Doug Ford's most important attribute, I think, as a politician, and the biggest contrast with Poilievre, is he's likable. People like him. My wife was at a conservative event yesterday, and she took a picture with him. She sent it to me. She was charmed. She's like, I got a picture with Doug. He is a likable, warm human being, and that, I think, resonates with a lot of people. There's a lot of voters, a lot of people I met back in Ontario, because I have family there, who were Trudeau Ford voters, and I couldn't understand it. I was like, how can you support Justin Trudeau and Doug Ford? And the more as time has gone on, the more I understand. Oh no, that's a real thing. He has appeal that goes beyond the conservative base, and that's exactly what they need. They need a guy who can go beyond that, like, angry online base of young men, and really kind of bring women in, bring immigrants in, bring traditional liberal voters in, and he might be the person on the landscape right now best suited to that. I would also suggest, I think it's not great that the Liberals have not had a woman as leader and prime minister in their history. I think it's kind of shameful that Canada's only had Kim Campbell for that hot minute as prime minister. If there was ever a party that was positioned to do it, it's the Conservatives. I think our first female prime minister will be a Conservative, and I, whether it's Christy Clark, whether it's Lisa Raitt, whether it's Rona Ambrose, whoever it is, there are tons of talented women who are in that movement, in that community. And maybe it's time for one of them to step forward and become leader.
Interesting point. We'll leave it there. Much more from you. As mentioned, nationalobserver.com. You're on X at Max Fawcett. Max, thanks so much for joining us. I really do appreciate this.
Yeah, it was a good chat, Rob. Anytime.
Okay, that is Max Fawcett. He's based in Calgary. He's the lead columnist for the National Observer, nationalobserver.com. Coming up in a moment, we'll shift our focus to the trade negotiations between Canada and the U.S., what happened last week and all the drama around the digital services tax, and also what's going on this week as Donald Trump has extended the pause on some tariffs, but sent letters to other countries imposing new tariffs. And are we still on a target or a deadline to get a Canada-U.S. trade agreement? We'll hear from Daniel Schwanen with the CD Howe Institute. You're listening to The Rob Breakenridge Show. Welcome back. So there's been no shortage of drama or uncertainty on the trade front, both in terms of Canada and U.S. trade negotiations, but also with the U.S. and, well, pretty much everybody. You might recall a few months ago, Donald Trump announced these so-called Liberation Day tariffs, different rates that were just going to apply to pretty much every country around the world. Then they decided to pause that. That pause was set to expire July 9th, so Wednesday of this week. But it sounds like the White House is now going to extend that pause, but not for everybody. So in addition to the pause being announced this week, Trump himself has announced that letters are going to start being sent to other countries, informing them of new tariffs that are taking effect right away. And that includes U.S. trading partners like Japan and South Korea. So remember, what the White House had said at the time was that, 90 days, they were going to get 90 deals in 90 days. They don't really have any. There's kind of a framework with the UK and with China, and that's about it. So late Monday, President Trump was asked about, what happened to 90 deals in 90 days. Here's what he said.
Tariffs. What happened to 90 trade deals in 90 days?
We've spoken to everybody. We know everything. It's all done. I told you, we'll make some deals, but for the most part, we're going to send a letter. We're going to say, welcome to the United States if you'd like to participate in the greatest, most successful country ever. We're doing better than ever. I don't think, and you're going to see these numbers soon. We've never had numbers like this. We've never had investment like this. We have more than 90. We're going to have much more than 90, but most of those are going to be sent a letter. This is exactly what I said. Now, we've made a deal with United Kingdom. We've made a deal with China. We've made a deal. We're close to making a deal with India. Others we met with, and we don't think we're going to be able to make a deal, so we just send them a letter. If you want to play ball, you have to. This is what you have to pay. So, as far as I'm concerned, we're done. We're sending out letters to various countries, telling them how much tariffs they have to pay. Some will maybe adjust a little bit, depending if they have a cause. We're not going to be unfair about it. And actually, it's a small fraction compared to what we should be getting. We could be asking for much more, but for the sake of relationships that we've had with a lot of really good countries, we're doing the way I do it. But we could be getting a lot more. We could ask for a lot more than what we're asking for.
Okay, so where does that leave Canada in all of this? As far as we know, we're still on target for what was a separate identified date, a July 21st deadline to get a deal between Canada and the U.S. But remember last week, as we talked about, those talks derailed briefly. Donald Trump suddenly up and canceled talks, that he was ending talks with Canada. And this all concerned our digital services tax. It goes back to Justin Trudeau, a tax that was to have taken effect on June 30th. But after Trump canceled talks, Canada very quickly caved. We canceled the tax. That's it. It's gone. And that got talks back on track. So where it all goes from here, it's hard to say at this point. Supply management may still be a sticking point. Maybe other issues will come up as well. So, yeah, it's all very confusing and uncertain, but we certainly want to get past all of this trade drama to get at least something in place with the U.S., some kind of an agreement. So how do we go about that? And what does that need to look like, both in terms of our strategy now and what we hope the end result will be? The C.D. Howe Institute has been tracking all of this. You can read more. A strong, secure, and sovereign Canada, insights on a stronger, smarter, and more future-ready trade strategy at cdhowe.org. We're very pleased to welcome to the program award-winning economist Daniel Schwanen. He's a senior VP at the C.D. Howe Institute, again, cdhowe.org. Daniel, great to have you with us here. Welcome to the program.
Very happy to be here, Rob.
It's interesting. I mean, we're getting reports today that the U.S. is looking maybe to announce some trade agreements or to have some kind of trade announcements very soon, maybe as early as this week. But, of course, things almost derailed between Canada and the U.S. last week. Any sense of where things are at, first of all?
I'd like to say that I have a precise sense, but all we've got really are a couple of strong pointers. So, first of all, the U.S. has actually come to an agreement, I think, similar in concept or nature to what we're trying to get with them right now, which is not something incredibly detailed, but a framework agreement. How we're going to do this going forward. Ideally, something that would avoid tariffs on Canadian products, but some kind of quid pro quo or reciprocity, something that we would give the U.S., at least almost certainly by way of more security. Maybe, maybe they'll want us to do something about Chinese imports. So this is what's been happening with other countries. So we have these pointers. They have a framework agreement in place with the United Kingdom. They now have, just very recent, a framework agreement in place with Vietnam. Two very interesting case studies here for us. But both have left U.S. tariffs in place. And that's not what we want. So we need to do better than what they got.
Well, that's the thing, right? I mean, maybe that's a worrying sign. They hold up this agreement with Vietnam as some sort of trade deal, I guess, from an American perspective to celebrate. But as you say, I mean, it leaves tariffs in place on imports from Vietnam. Are we, or should we be worried that maybe we're in for something similar here?
We should certainly worry. But at the same time, I think that, our products, as well as Mexican products, are more important to the U.S. economy than anything that might come out of the UK or anything that might come out of Vietnam, even. Not so much on China, but they have other problems with China. And frankly, countries like China can probably afford to continue exporting if they face high tariffs as they do now, or Vietnam, in the U.S. market. For us, the markets are far more integrated. This is us being like Canada and US and Mexico and the US. So, when you start putting a tariff on something that's made in Canada or assembled in Canada, but that goes into the US, you're also putting a tariff essentially, or you're also slowing down US production, because so much of what we do includes US stuff. So the economies are more integrated. We are, the country in the world with which the U.S. has the biggest manufacturing trade surplus. So they have a manufacturing trade surplus with us. We're a very good customer of the U.S. They don't have any real incentive other than the politics of it. The perception that tariffs are good for them, which they want to uphold, and that is definitely the danger. But they don't really have objectively an incentive. It wouldn't be good for them if they weakened the Canadian economy. We are their best customer, and we're also a major supplier of things that, notwithstanding what Mr. Trump has been saying, they need. That includes auto parts, that include airplane parts, that include some aluminum, which they don't produce in the U.S. in the same quantities, and they need. So I think we have more leverage. Is my bottom line here, and there's still hope that we can get to an agreement that will recognize those realities on the part of the U.S., where the U.S. recognizes those realities and gives us at least a better deal than what they gave Vietnam and the U.K.
Yeah, let's hope so. Look, there are some trade irritants, and I think maybe the U.S. has some legitimate complaints about certain aspects of how Canada approaches things like supply management, or even as we saw with the digital services tax, and Trump had called off talks briefly because the tax was set to come into effect, and then we withdrew that. We got rid of the tax very quickly. So that was an interesting approach from Canada's perspective, to have pushed this trade irritant for as long as we did and then just scrap it so quickly. What did you make of that?
Well, I don't think we ended up looking super good there, or really, what's the word I'm looking for? Forward looking. So the fact that this tax was came into effect, or was to come into effect, right in the middle of these negotiations, no matter how far ahead of time it had been announced, we knew that the moment Mr. Trump was going to lay eyes on this headline, he would say, well, what's going on? Let's stop everything, right? We've been complaining about this for years, or this possibility for years, and now it's coming reality. So, no, that I don't think that we increased our leverage there. Put it that way. We probably got reduced a little bit, and I think that we gave the signal to the U.S. That when there's not just something that they complain about, there are things they complain about that they're not right about, but on supply management, and of course I realize this is a touchy issue, but we're going to have to do better. We're going to have to be inventive if we're going to come to a deal, and maybe that will be evoked in whatever framework agreement we reach with them in coming days, which is still the hope. Now, a framework agreement doesn't mean a full-on trade negotiation. One thing that makes me it's hard to be optimistic, but one sort of optimism is that Mr. Trump, for all his complaining, has left elements of the USMCA or CUSMA, the trilateral deal with the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, in place. That is to say, a huge chunk of our trade right now still goes through tariff-free, in spite of all these big tariff announcements. Not aluminum, not steel. I'll certainly grant you that. And that's that's a big sore point. But the reality is that most of the trade right now goes through tariff-free because we're still members of that trilateral agreement. So there is a process in place in the United States to review that agreement, and they'll want changes. But hopefully this is something that can stay in place and anchor at least a huge chunk of trade that could still go through without tariffs. And again, that comes because they would agree to that because I think the integration of the three economies makes them stronger and more competitive on the global stage. And that's the point that I'm sure we're trying to make. So there's going to be a framework agreement, and probably that will lay the groundwork, or at least the hope for more detailed negotiations that the hope is will be still around some form of trilateral agreement with a lot of zero tariffs. But it could blow up. It could blow up, and we see at any minute. Yeah.
Well, that's the thing. And I did want to ask you about internal trade in Canada, because I think, the threat from the U.S. has refocused attention on this issue, and how do we reduce trade barriers within Canada? Bill C-5 attempts to advance that. So you've got a piece up at cdhowe.org on this very question that, there's a lot more that can be done, and a lot more, I guess, that the provinces need to do here, right?
Yes. So what the good news is that I don't think that there's a single government in this country for which all of a sudden, because of the difficulty of accessing, or prospective difficulties of accessing the U.S. market, all of a sudden internal trade and East-West trade in general, right? Yeah. So exporting to other countries via stronger East-West infrastructure, as well as internally among us, has now become the priority, or a top priority, of virtually every government in the country. And but it's still pretty difficult to bring about. Governments have taken major steps to harmonize some standards, and we need to recognize that there is something called the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, and some predecessor agreements, the New West Partnership Trade Agreement, that had some exceptions, and governments have really removed a lot of federal and provincial removed a lot of the exceptions under these agreements. So trade, provinces all across the country have raised the limit to the quantity of alcohol that you can import from other provinces if you travel by yourself. There's still some other barriers regarding alcohol that you may want to order from another province, but I think we're going to tackle those as well. The difficulties still remain. Not every province is recognizing other provinces' standards as equivalent, but there's been a lot of progress on that. But there's still a lot of areas where you need common standards, and that's more difficult. So, for example, if you're a trucker and you go from Alberta to Manitoba to Ontario, well, you're facing three different types of potentially, and in actuality, of a number of rules that apply to you that are different in each of the three provinces. And there's no point Ontario saying, well, I recognize the right of Manitoba to have their own rules. The point is that for the trucker, it's you still have to comply with of course, the speed limits, but that's an illustration. There are many other rules that apply in each of the provinces that you cross. So for that and a few other things, if you're building across the country, you may face different. We're making progress on building codes, but different safety requirements on different construction sites, right? If you're the same company and you move workers across the country, you need to change depending on where you operate. So harmonizing, literally having common standards, right, as much as possible, is also a work in progress. It's not the same as mutual recognition. It requires a lot of detailed work, and we've made some progress, but that takes a longer time.
Yeah. Well, much more on all of this, as mentioned, cdhowe.org. Daniel, thank you so much for the insight. Appreciate you making some time for us here.
You're very welcome. It's my pleasure.
Okay, that is Daniel Schwanen. He's Senior VP at the C.D. Howe Institute, cdhowe.org. Also, our thanks to Max Fawcett and to Andrew Leach. That is going to do it for us on this episode of the program. Don't forget to follow us and subscribe at our Substack page, robbreakenridge.ca. This podcast is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and other podcast platforms. And don't forget our YouTube channel. Check us out. We're on YouTube at Rob Breakenridge Show. We'll be back with a new episode for you, the Rob Breakenridge Show, coming up on Friday. Again, robbreakenridge.ca is the website. Have a terrific week, folks, and we will talk to you on Friday. Take care.
Bye.